We decided to spend the evening in nature as planned. I, Alex, and my friends Sophia, Lucas, and two others loaded up an old van with food and everything we needed for a picnic. When we arrived at the forest, we realized we were short on firewood, and I suggested we stop by an old, abandoned gas station I had seen nearby. We thought it would be a fun adventure and a bit of a thrill. The gas station looked eerie. The sun had already set and darkness enveloped everything around us. We started joking around and taking pictures in front of the worn-out signs and pumps. The laughter began to fade when I noticed a strange liquid dripping from one of the pumps. I went closer, and when I opened the cap, black, sticky drops fell out, accompanied by a strange sound, as if something was moving inside. I wanted to make a joke, but there was something about that liquid and its sounds that sent a chill down my spine. Sophia noticed that strange, glowing symbols appeared on the old display. They kept changing, and each time I blinked, the symbols became less and less decipherable. It was all starting to feel unsettling. Suddenly, we heard a muffled crack, and for a moment, strange shadows flickered above our heads. We all froze in fear, but tried to calm down. When we returned to the van, we discovered that the keys were missing. At first, I thought someone might have just misplaced them, but as we began searching, it became clear that the keys had vanished without a trace. The night was terrifying. Strange rustling and creaking sounds surrounded us. At one point, Sophia spotted shadows in the distance. They looked like human figures, but as soon as we got closer, they vanished. Our tension grew, and panic began to set in. Lucas, who was probably the bravest among us, decided to check the source of a strange knocking sound coming from inside the old building. We were all scared for him, but he went anyway. We tried to find him, but every time we got close to the last place he was seen, everything became darker and more ominous. By dawn, we finally found the keys. The gas station looked even more run down than before. We managed to get out, but what we went through left a deep mark. The gas station remained in our minds as a place that doesn't release its victims and leaves them changed forever. None of us dares to go near it anymore. We try to forget that night, but the fear and horror of what we experienced have stayed with us forever. It was an ordinary night. I had spent the evening at a friend's house, enjoying a glass of wine and conversation. When the clock struck midnight, I decided to head home. The roads were empty, and as always, I relished the tranquility of nighttime driving. However, when I got onto the highway, I noticed that the fuel gauge had dropped almost to empty. Suddenly, my calm was gone. In the distance, I saw a dimly glowing neon sign for a gas station. I pulled into the parking lot. My car was the only object on the deserted stretch of road. As I was refueling, I had the unsettling feeling that someone was watching me. I decided it was just fatigue and continued filling up. When I returned to the car, I found a note under the windshield wiper that read, "I'm here." My pulse quickened. Trying to calm myself, I began my drive home. But the uneasy feeling wouldn't leave me. Every shadow, every sound seemed suspicious. As I arrived home, I noticed a car parked on the side of the road with its headlights off. I tried not to panic and quickly went inside. But there, waiting for me, was another note with the message I told you. Panic overwhelmed me, and I called the police. The operators were calm, but I felt like time was working against me. The police were on their way, but each second felt like an eternity. I hid in the dark corridor, listening to the sounds outside. Soon I heard a knock on the door and rustling at the windows. Every movement, every sound in the silence emphasized the danger. My fear grew as I awaited the arrival of the responders. When the police arrived, they found no one. Everything was quiet, just as before. There were no signs or confirmations that anyone had been nearby. However, I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't just a prank. They found strange footprints around my house, but nothing concrete. The officers assured me they would patrol the area, but my fears remained. Every day I felt like someone was watching me. I became reclusive, avoiding going outside at night. The notes continued to appear, and each word seemed like a threat. "I know you're afraid your life is in danger." These words felt like a sentence. I had no idea who was after me or why. My friends and colleagues began to notice changes in my behavior. I became suspicious, distrustful even of those close to me. I analyzed every action, every sound. This continued until one night when I saw a shadow at my window and decided to take action. I gathered all my resolve and armed myself. That night, when I saw the car again outside my house, I was prepared. I watched from the window and waited until the figure in the darkness approached the door. I ran out, dashed to the car, and found a person sitting inside wearing a mask. His eyes gleamed in the headlights. I recognized him. It was an old colleague whom I had once fired. He wanted revenge and used his knowledge to make my life a nightmare. I called the police, and now that the threat was eliminated, I could begin to recover. My life would never be the same, but at least I had found the source of my distress and regained control of my life. Story 2. At the edge of a small town surrounded by gloomy forests and winding trails stood an old gas station. The station had long since lost the enticing neon lights that once attracted motorists, but it still operated. It was a quiet and slightly eerie place, rarely visited. The owner of the station, a solitary man named Friedrich, took care of the maintenance and repair of the old equipment. Friedrich was tall and thin, his eyes filled with exhaustion and worry. He rarely left the station and did not socialize with the townspeople. His days were spent in monotonous work, and his nights were spent in solitary vigil by an old radio, which barely picked up any signals. One particularly dark and rainy night, when the downpour showed no sign of letting up, Friedrich noticed a strange light in the forest, not far from the station. At first, he thought it might be the light of a meteor or a reflection from the wet trees. However, the more he looked, the clearer the light became. It was a dim green glow, seemingly emanating from deep within the forest. Friedrich tried to ignore it, but curiosity overcame his fear. He took a flashlight and ventured into the forest to find the source of the light. Each step on the forest path seemed unnaturally loud, and the sound of the rain was amplified. Soon he arrived at a small clearing where the light was brightest. There, among the trees, he saw a strange structure, a weathered stone altar covered in moss and lichen. The altar was surrounded by a wreath of old, tattered black ribbons wrapped around it like serpents. On its surface lay a peculiar book, its pages covered with mysterious symbols and drawings. Friedrich felt a cold breeze and a shiver down his spine, but his curiosity overcame his fear. He touched the book, and at that moment, the sensation of cold intensified. As soon as he opened the book, he felt that the forest around him had grown even darker and more menacing. Flipping through the pages, he came across a drawing of a person who looked like himself, only in a dreadful state. His eyes were hollow, and his skin was gray and wrinkled. Under the drawing was written "The Outsider, Forever Bound." Friedrich set the book aside, but soon noticed that the light had disappeared, and the forest was plunged into complete darkness. Trying to return, Friedrich discovered that the path had vanished. He wandered through the forest, but despite the rain and darkness, he felt as though someone was watching him. With each step, the sound of the rain grew louder, and it seemed like whispers were coming from beneath the ground. He began to panic and run, but the forest only grew denser. Finally, he saw a light appearing before him, but it was not the same light he had seen earlier. It was a ghastly, dead light emanating from the old, dilapidated gas station. Friedrich, exhausted and drained, returned to the station. He thought it had all been a nightmare, but soon he noticed something strange. The following night, Friedrich noticed that some items in his room had disappeared. They were not just tools, but personal belongings he had never left behind. It was as if someone had stolen them but left behind a strange mark, like it had been made by black, skeletal fingers. Over the following days, Friedrich began to experience bizarre visions. He saw himself in the mirror, but the reflection was distorted and semi-transparent. At night, he heard strange rustlings, as if someone was moving around his room. Every time he tried to sleep, he would wake up in a cold sweat, feeling as though someone was watching him. One night, when the rain began to beat against the station's roof once more, Friedrich was certain he could not endure it any longer. He decided to find the book and try to understand what was happening. But when he returned to the forest, he found that the altar had vanished. The forest was empty and silent, and there was no trace of the previous light. Returning to the station, Friedrich noticed that its condition had begun to deteriorate. It was as if the building itself had become part of the forest, filling with fog and cold. Each day it became more difficult to maintain the station's functionality. Friedrich constantly felt trapped, and with each passing day his sanity unraveled. On the night he last looked at his hands, he saw that they had become white and glassy like a corpse's. He realized that the book he had found was not merely an old artifact but a vessel of a curse that had trapped him in an endless cycle of horror. Each night he relived the same nightmare over and over until he became just a part of that dreadful station, having lost its essence in the mist of the forest. They say that if you drive past the old gas station, you can hear the creak of the old radio and the rustling of the rain. Sometimes in the dead of night you might see a faint green light piercing through the trees, and if you listen closely you might hear the soft, mournful whisper of Friedrich, still trying to find a way out of his own nightmare.